Black and you dare put on a uniform. Officer Reed Harker roared, slamming his fist against the car window as if he wanted to shatter the entire metal frame. In a flash, he grabbed Amina Rowe by the collar and yanked her toward him, his breath with fury. "Take it off. Someone like you is not worthy of touching this." But the moment his hand tightened, a cold piece of metal slipped from Amina's collar and fell with a sharp clang onto the concrete floor, an emblem carried only by those who had walked out of top-secret missions. And then everything flipped in an instant. Amina straightened up, her gaze cutting sharper than the blazing heat. "Do you have any idea who you just laid hands on? If you were Reed Harker in that moment, would you keep abusing your power or fall silent with the truth lying right at your feet? In your opinion, what ending does Reed deserve? Comment now. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next part." The blazing noon sun poured over the parking lot in front of the convenience store, the pavement so hot that waves of heat shimmered in the air. The place had just witnessed an argument loud enough for nearby residents to call the police. The echoes of shouting and cursing still lingered, yet the scene had settled into a false calm. Next to the patrol car, parked at an angle by the entrance, Officer Reed Harker and Brent Cole leaned against the vehicle, the two having wrapped up the incident only minutes earlier. Reed kept his usual smug expression, glancing around as if waiting for someone to acknowledge his so-called authority. Cole spoke less, only nodding along, while Reed retold the incident with obvious delight, as if they had just achieved something impressive. While the two were still talking, the glass door of the convenience store swung open. A black woman stepped inside, her build lean and steady, her movements calm. It was Amina Rowe. The uniform she wore stood in sharp contrast to the ordinary surroundings and the distracted passers-by. Reed immediately locked onto her, his eyes narrowing before filling with open mockery. He tilted his head and spoke loudly enough for Cole to hear his tone dripping with blunt contempt. "Look at that, a black woman in a uniform. Looks ridiculous." Cole glanced over, not approving, but not stopping him either. Amina's composure only made Reed's voice sound harsher in the quiet air. Amina did not look their way. She walked in, chose a bottle of water, paid, and stepped back outside, moving with the ease of someone long accustomed to being watched and judged, yet uninterested in responding to it. As she walked out the door, the sunlight reflected off the luxury car she headed toward. A few people in the lot looked up, but the strongest reaction came from Reed. He straightened, staring as if spotting a criminal. "A black woman driving that car," his voice sharpened, carrying both surprise and a clear desire to provoke. His words were not a question or a doubt. They were an accusation shaped by skin color and the prejudice he treated as truth. Amina opened the car door, set the bottle on the passenger seat, and sat down. The heat outside had not even faded when a sharp pounding struck the air, hard as stone hit in metal. Reed had rushed up to the car before she could close the door. He slammed his hand against the window with such force that anyone nearby would flinch. His large palm spread across the glass, violent and challenging. Cole stood a few steps behind, hesitation flickering in his eyes, yet he still said nothing. Amina turned her head, her calm gaze unchanged in the face of Reed's rising anger. The moment was so quiet that only the hum of the car's air conditioning and the dry wind curling around the parking lot could be heard. Reed lowered his face close to the glass, his eyes marked with threat. There was no explanation and no legitimate reason, only a mix of authority, prejudice, and the urge to exert pressure driving him forward. Amina's calmness felt like a quiet flame overshadowing his aggression. She showed no fear and did not back down, and that alone made Reed even more irritated. He forced out each word, striking the window again to draw more attention from the people who had begun to look over. "Step out of the car." His voice was dry and commanding, leaving no doubt about his intent to dominate. The blazing air seemed to tighten around the three of them. Amina looked at him with steady eyes, while people walking through the lot started to sense something was wrong. A few phones were raised from a distance, and several pairs of eyes eyes followed with a mix of curiosity and unease. Everything in the parking lot felt as if it slowed down, as though everyone was stepping into the beginning of a mistake bigger than anyone could imagine. Reed stayed pressed close to the door, fully convinced he had the right to pull her out in any way he chose. In the final seconds of this opening moment, no answer had been spoken, but no one at the scene doubted anything anymore. The situation was not going to end here, and Amina, even without saying a word, had placed herself at the center of a storm, her composure fueling Reed's anger more than ever. Amina looked directly at the fist still imprinted on the glass, then lowered the window, the heat rushing in without affecting her expression. Her calm gaze made Reed's aggression crash against a cold wall. Her voice was clear and sharp as she asked, "The reason I need to step out of the car?" Reed scowled as if the question itself were an insult. He froze for half a second before slipping back into his usual hostility. His expression shifted into something clumsy and forced, revealing the attitude of a man searching for an excuse. "Someone reported you for stealing inside the market," Reed replied smoothly, as if the words had been prepared in advance. In reality, no one had reported anything, no one had run out to call them, and no employee had asked for help. But Reed spoke with the confidence of someone used to twisting situations wherever he wanted. Amina remained still, her eyes unwavering, and her composure made Cole behind her feel unsettled. He glanced quickly toward the store, clearly seeing no sign that anyone had just lost something. Yet he stayed silent. Reed had spoken, and Cole chose to stand behind him, unwilling to interfere. Amina did not argue or deny anything. Her behavior was not submission. It was deliberate restraint. She opened the door and stepped out with steady confidence. A few people nearby looked over, not understanding what was happening, but sensing the tension in the air. Amina stood in front of Reed, close enough for him to see every detail of her uniform, which only seemed to irritate him further. His eyes moved down the car's body, then back to her with a prejudiced scrutiny. He smirked and spoke with a tone that treated his assumption as fact. "Nice car? Who are you borrowing it from?" Every word landed with the intention of breaking through her calm. Amina answered immediately, her voice direct and concise. "Mine." There was no hesitation and no attempt to justify herself. It was the response of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. Reed let out a laugh mixed with mockery and satisfaction. "Someone like you cannot even afford a tire," he said, delivering the insult with intent. A few people, standing farther away, exchanged uneasy looks, but none dared step in. Reed seemed energized, ready to push the situation further. He straightened and crossed his arms like a judge passing verdict. "Papers. Hand them over." His words sounded more like a sentence than a request. Amina showed no change in expression. She tilted her head slightly, returned to the car, and opened the door to check the storage compartment. Her hand reached the usual spot for the car documents, but the empty space inside said everything. She paused for a moment, not panicking, only checking once more to be sure. The moment she realized she had left her documents at home appeared in her eyes like a simple thought, not a frightening mistake. But for Reed, it was the perfect excuse. Cole stood nearby, watching everything, his expression clearly uneasy. He knew Reed always searched for people easy to bully to satisfy his ego, and this situation was unfolding exactly the way Reed liked. Amina closed the compartment, stepped out of the car with calm composure, but Reed had already seen what he wanted. His face lit up like a man who had just opened a box full of reasons to stretch his authority. Amina stood straight in front of him, with nothing to hide and without the slightest sign of worry. Her steadiness made Reed feel challenged, as if she were standing outside the game he thought he was controlling. He stepped forward, no longer needing to disguise his aggression. The parking lot fell into an odd quiet, the sound of cars on the distant road and the faint conversations behind the store's glass blending into a tense silence. Reed stared at her as though his authority were threatened by the unwavering eyes of a woman he believed should be trembling. A few people walking by slowed down, their eyes turning toward the scene with suspicion. Cole remained behind them with a troubled look on his face. He did not agree with the way Reed spoke, yet he found no reason to intervene when Amina showed no sign of resistance. Reed was different. He saw her calmness as a thorn pressing into his already fragile pride. He took a slow breath, preparing to say something else, and the heat along with the strained AI made every word he was about to utter carry the scent of dominance and hostility. In that moment, the situation seemed destined to escalate with every move from anyone in the lot. Reed stood facing Amina, as if waiting for the smallest action to explode. Amina remained there with her back straight, her eyes steady, neither avoiding nor shifting in color. She was silent, but the silence was not surrender. It was the confidence of someone who knew her own position, and that alone made Reed even more determined to push the moment to its limit. Amina stood facing Reed in the Susan-soaked, darkening lot, the heat rising from the pavement making the air seem to tremble around their feet. She looked straight at him, her voice calm in a way that contrasted completely with the tension building around them. "I forgot my documents. I will call someone from home to bring them." As soon as she finished, Reed let out a sharp, short laugh that sliced through the quiet. He raised his eyebrows, the corner of his eye twitching before he shouted loud enough for anyone not yet watching to turn their heads. "Oh, calling your crew for backup, smart move." From his tone to his stare, Reed was radiating the satisfaction of a man who believed he had found the perfect excuse to push someone into a weaker position. His words rang across the wide lot, making a few onlookers exchange confused glances. Cole flinched slightly, as if he had not expected Reed to escalate the situation further. He glanced toward Amina and saw her wearing the same steady expression, showing none of the fear or guilt Reed wanted to see to feel victorious. That only irritated Reed more, as though her calmness were a direct challenge. Reed drew a deep breath, his broad shoulders lifting, then dropping as if preparing to launch into a trial where he had already decided the verdict. His eyes scanned Amina's uniform again, this time without hiding the hatred behind his scrutiny. "I cannot stand people who pretend," Reed growled, stepping closer until he blocked her path. "Take that uniform off." His voice dropped low, but was thick with venom, a command born from hostility rather than authority. He was not looking at Amina as a person, but as something crossing a boundary he believed belonged to him. Small murmurs rippled through the area like waves spreading from a stone hid in water. Eyes from inside the store began to shift toward them. A few people stopping right at the entrance with bags in hand, their faces wide with the tension unfolding in front of them. The attention of the crowd only fed the fire inside Reed, while Amina remained steady and unmoved. She answered immediately, her voice calm but cold enough to make a few nearby onlookers stiffen. "This is my uniform." The simple sentence spoken under Reed's glare cut straight into his twisted pride. For a brief moment he stood still, not out of respect, but because his rising anger had no clear place to go. His stare shifted visibly from suspicion to accusation. Inside the store, a few people pressed closer to the glass for a clearer view. A young woman set her bag on the counter and stood still, eyes fixed on the scene. An older man tugged his friend closer, whispering without looking away. Bit by bit, every gaze was locking on to Amina and the two officers. Reed stepped forward again, his heavy breath filling the space between them. "Sounds nice when you say it," he snorted, his eyes reddened with anger, "but I do not believe you." His tone was no longer suspicious. It was a declaration, a verdict shaped entirely by his own prejudice. Reed did not ask another question to verify anything. To him, her skin color and the luxury car were two signs enough to decide that Amina could not possibly be wearing that uniform legitimately. Cole stood a half step behind Reed, his face showing a flicker of discomfort. Even so, he kept silent, unwilling to step into the growing confrontation. He glanced at Amina and noticed that the calmness in her eyes had not faded. The way she stood and the way she responded carried a steadiness he could not quite explain. Cole began to sense that Reed and Amina belonged to two different worlds. One was brute hostility, the other strangely solid, like a cold wind cutting through the scorching noon heat. Amina adjusted her stance, facing Reed without moving backward. It was not a challenge, but a readiness to confront. She seemed to understand that retreating would only push Reed further. More people gathered around them, forming a wide circle that kept its distance but kept every pair of eyes fixed on the rising tension. Reed brought his hand to his belt, brushing the radio with the practiced reflex of an officer wanting to assert control. He did not call for backup or request verification. He only wanted Amina to know he believed he controlled everything. But Amina continued to look at him without flinching. Her quiet presence was like still water on the surface, with strength hidden beneath, and the more Reed sensed it, the more he wanted to break it. The moment stretched thin like a cord about to snap. Soft whispers rose from the background as people began asking questions no one dared to say aloud. Why would a woman who only bought a drink receive such hostility from two officers? Why was someone in uniform treated like a criminal caught in the act? And why did Amina remain so calm, as if she had faced this kind of confrontation many times before? Reed looked at Amina one more time before speaking, his eyes flashing with the determination of someone desperate to win at any cost. But what surprised him was not her reaction. It was the crowd surrounding them. Their attention, their stares, and their silent judgment turned the private confrontation into a public scene. That only made Reed more determined to prove he was right. At this point, suspicion had fully turned into accusation. Reed had placed himself in direct opposition to Amina in front of witnesses who showed their disapproval openly. Amina remained steady, as if waiting for the truth to reveal itself through every wrong action committed by the man standing before her. This was the first moment showing that the confrontation was beyond argument and would continue escalating into a mistake no one could stop. The parking lot grew thick with tension, climbing higher every second. The heat felt as if it pressed down on the shoulders of everyone watching. Reed stood facing Amina with eyes burning with hostility, while Amina's steady calm made him feel challenged. Whispers spread through the crowd, people tilting their heads to see better, a few stepping a bit closer, not to intervene, but to witness how far the confrontation would go. Cole stood half a step behind Reed, his face clearly conflicted, his uneasy gaze shifting between Reed and Amina, as if he were searching for a way out, but had no idea where to start. Amid the cracking atmosphere, a voice, old yet firm, rose from the left and cut through the aggression, pushing everything toward the edge. "You are breaking the law." An older man stepped out from near the light pole, tall and thin, but not weak. His short, silver hair and sharp eyes belonged to someone who had spent many years facing tense situations. This was Walter Briggs. He stopped a few steps from Reed with his chin slightly raised enough for his voice to carry to everyone around. Reed turned immediately, surprise flashing across his face, before anger replaced it, as if Walter's presence were an insult to him in front of the public. "What do you know to stick your nose in?" Reed barked, then shoved Walter hard enough that people nearby drew in a sharp breath. But Walter did not fall. He only stepped back half a pace before steadying himself again, his eyes fixed on Reed. They were not the eyes of someone looking for a fight, but of a man who had faced aggressive people throughout a lifetime in law enforcement. "I served 40 years on the force," Walter said, his voice low but uncompromising. "I know the law better than you." The words hit Reed's arrogance like a slap. For a brief moment, the confident bravado on his face cracked. He had not expected an older man and a retired officer to insert himself into the confrontation he was pushing with all his weight. Cole looked startled, his eyes widening at Walter's statement. The name knew that Walter Briggs had once been one of the most respected officers in the area for many years. Cole noticed Reed falter, but within that brief second he also saw something far more dangerous. Reed was not backing down. The humiliation of being called out by an older man in front of a crowd was already twisting into blind rage. Reed clenched his jaw, the veins on his neck standing out. He looked at Walter as if deciding whether to shove him harder or shout over the embarrassment boiling in his chest. But the crowd was watching, many pairs of eyes pointed at him, and that only made him angrier because he knew every move he made was being witnessed. He snapped his head back toward Amina as if Walter's presence had stolen the target he had chosen from the start. Amina stayed still, her eyes sharp, every movement controlled and measured. Reed stepped closer, his face reddening with anger as the turmoil inside him searched for a way out. Walter saw it, his brow tightening as he spoke quietly enough for Reed to hear clearly. "A warning, you are going too far." His tone carried no threat, only the weight of experience from someone who understood consequences better than anyone here. Reed turned back, his nostrils flaring. Cole instinctively moved a small step forward as if preparing to intervene should Reed truly cross the line. The crowd murmured louder. Amina watched their movements with an unreadable expression, yet her face remained unchanged. She did not escalate the situation, but she did not step back either. She stood there with a steadiness that made Reed lose even more control. Reed exhaled sharply and swung toward Amina, his voice a growl meant to reassure himself that he was still in charge. "Fine. You say you forgot your documents. So how are you planning to explain yourself to the law now?" The question made no logical sense, but Reed did not care. He needed the person in front of him to feel small, needed to regain the upper hand that Walter had stripped from him with a single sentence. The air in the parking lot felt heavy, like a storm about to break. Those standing nearby kept their eyes fixed on the confrontation, every word and gesture adding more weight to the tension. Walter studied Reed with the weary eyes of someone who knew exactly what would happen if no one calmed things down. But Reed was beyond reason, driven by pride. What held him back was not conscience, but the sensation of being watched by every person present. Cole tried to speak, but Reed snapped his fingers and barked with anger, "Do not interfere." The words were not meant for Cole alone, but thrown into the air to remind everyone that he believed he still controlled the moment. He looked at Amina again, his eyes filled with irritation, suspicion, and wounded pride. Amina remained where she stood, untouched by the aggression spilling from Reed. Walter stayed positioned between rational restraint and Reed's impending outburst. Cole still hesitated between doing what was right and following the silence he had grown accustomed to. And Reed, cornered by the crowd's gaze and his own embarrassment, pushed the confrontation higher in a frantic attempt to protect his crumbling ego. The air seemed unable to tighten any further, yet in truth, the encounter had not even reached the real storm. The air in the parking lot was stretched tight, like a cord pulled to its limit, waiting for the slightest force to snap. Walter Briggs stood firm in the heat and rising hostility pouring off Reed Harker. The onlookers formed a wide circle, none daring to step in, yet every gaze pressed like an invisible weight against Reed's aggression. He felt those eyes, and instead of calming, he grew more agitated, driven by the sense of being challenged, watched, and judged. His pride swelled and ignited like a spark meeting wind. Reed shot Walter a hateful look as if the old man's presence were a stain he needed to erase. Then he turned to Amina, a twisted smile spreading across his face, carrying venomous mockery without restraint. "Another black monkey taking your side." His words tore through the heavy silence, harsh and naked enough to make several nearby witnesses step back in shock. The insult hit not only Amina, but the entire community silently watching this confrontation unfold. Amina heard every syllable, each word landing like a stone on her chest, yet she she did not step back. She stood tall, shoulders steady, eyes fixed on Reed with a cold sharpness that made the line he had crossed unmistakable. "You have no right to insult him," she said, her voice calm but firm. There was no tremble, no hint of fragile hurt, only resolve strong enough to make people hold their breath. Her pushback was not meant to provoke, but to make clear she was not someone Reed could manipulate. Reed reacted as if someone had thrown a lit match into an open fuel can. He lost control completely. The veins on his neck pulsed, his eyes widened, and his breath poured out in ragged bursts of rage. "You dare talk back to me!" he roared like an animal. Before anyone could respond, Reed lunged his large hand, snapping around Amina's neck in a violent, impulsive grip. In that instant, the parking lot seemed to stretch tighter, then snapped with Amina's single movement. Her body reacted on instinct with the precision shaped by years of real combat. No need to brace, no need to think, no need to strike back. Amina simply turned to set her balance and redirected his force along its own path. Her motion was so clean that some nearby did not even understand what had happened. Reed stumbled back half a step from the recoil of his own aggression while Amina remained still, her breath even, her eyes unchanged. The movement was not an attack. It was a warning, the final boundary she tried to keep before things went too far. But to Reed, that small failure exploded inside the fragile pride burning in his chest. Being stopped by Amina was something he could not swallow, especially with the crowd watching every move. A sharp breath rose from the crowd and someone murmured, "She only defended herself." The comment made Reed's anger flare even harder, as if struck by a whip. Cole stepped closer, his face pale, unsure whether to restrain Reed or let him charge again. His eyes shifted from the onlookers to Amina, his unease growing by the second. He had never seen Reed lose control like this, and he had never seen a woman respond as calmly as Amina after being attacked. The noise from the crowd grew louder. A young mother holding her child stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. A middle-aged man muttered about filming everything as evidence. A young man lifted his phone, its screen lighting up in the heavy heat. Amina noticed and held her body in a ready but non-threatening stance. She understood that this confrontation was no longer between her and Reed. It had become an event watched by dozens of witnesses. "You are abusing your power," a man shouted. His words shattered the silence and immediately drew echoes. "That is right. She did nothing. Stop it." The voices rose like pounding drums, feeding the fire in the air. Reed heard every word, each one slicing into his swollen pride. What he hated most was being seen as wrong in front of others, and now the crowd's outrage pushed him deeper into a corner. Amina saw the shift in Reed's eyes, saw the blind rage turning him into someone reckless and more dangerous. She stayed firm, maintaining a safe distance, not retreating but refusing to become an easy target for another outburst. In that moment, she understood that this breaking point would determine everything that followed. Reed, with reddened eyes and ragged breath, stood at a line he did not realize he was crossing. The parking lot had become a public stage where abuse of power was turning into collective outrage. Amina remained standing, her back straight in the storm swirling around her, while Reed pushed himself deeper into his own mistakes in front of witnesses he could not erase. The conflict had officially erupted, no longer belonging to one person, but transforming into an accusation that the entire parking lot could see. The noise in the parking lot kept spreading like echoing waves, and with every shot more eyes turned toward Amina and Reed. In the midst of the murmurs, a young clear voice rose above everything. Little Lana, her hair tied in two small pigtails and her tiny hand gripping her mother's, looked toward the confrontation with wide, questioning eyes. She looked at Amina, then at Reed, her innocent face unable to hide her confusion. "Mom, is that policeman a bad guy? He is bullying her." The simple question cut through the air like a thin blade, making several nearby people turn while others immediately glanced toward the child and her mother. Mira jolted, her face paling in an instant, her eyes darting around as if afraid someone might have heard her daughter. She bent down, covering Lana's mouth gently but hurriedly, whispering with tense urgency, "Hush, Maybe she did something wrong, Gay, and that is why the police are acting like that. Mira's voice trembled, not out of fear of Amina or belief that the officers were right, but from the deep, long-standing worry etched into her after many years. A fear with no name urging adults to teach children silence in the face of authority, even when that authority was clearly showing injustice. Lana wriggled lightly, her young eyes wide and pure enough to draw the attention of those around her. Her small face carried a quiet but firm disagreement, as if her innocent mind understood something many adults had chosen to ignore. Mira tightened her hold, but doing so only made the silence between them more painful, a complete reflection of what Amina was witnessing. It was not the child's fear, but the mother's fear being passed down, the instinctive lesson of silence inherited from generations who had seen power wielded the wrong way. Amina stood nearby, her eyes catching the scene as it unfolded. She heard every word Lana spoke, every tremble in Mira's reply, and her gaze lowered slightly, not from anger, but from a familiar sorrow. It was a sadness deeper than the insults Reed had thrown, deeper than the hand he had placed on her neck. Lana's question was not just the curiosity of a child, it was a truth spoken by a mind untouched by prejudice, a mind clear enough to say what adults had grown used to avoiding. Amina tilted her head gently, looking at the mother and daughter as if seeing a piece of memory. She remembered her own childhood, hearing her mother speak of confrontations with authority born only from the color of her skin. She remembered the times her mother gripped her hand tightly and whispered, "Keep your distance. Do not speak. Do not do anything that could cause trouble." Those words did not come from guilt, but from witnessing too many moments where right and wrong were defined by a badge and skin tone. And now, the exact scene stood before her again in a busy parking lot on an ordinary day that was never truly ordinary. Reed was still furious, breathing hard after Amina redirected him, yet he did not realize the confrontation had already moved beyond anything he thought he controlled. Lana's words lingered in the air, making several people shift their attention from Reed to Amina, then to the mother and child. The innocence of the little girl forced them to reconsider, to question something even they had avoided, why a child could see the truth more clearly than all the adults. Cole heard Lana's question as well. He glanced at the girl, then back at Reed, and a flicker of hesitation appeared in his eyes. He began to recognize that the injustice was no longer hidden. Reed's confidence was no longer solid, but Cole stayed trapped in the habit of obedience carved into him through years of silence. The scorching noon of what should have been an ordinary day had become a moment Amina knew she would never forget. She watched Lana for a few seconds, her gaze softening with each short breath. The sorrow in her eyes was not weakness. It was the deep understanding of someone who had witnessed too much injustice, who knew too well the invisible cycle that society had created and passed down through generations. A cycle that pushed people into fear even when they had done nothing wrong. Mira pulled Lana back slightly, trying to avoid the attention gathering around them. Lana kept looking at Amina with wide eyes, her lips parting as if she wanted to say more before her mother tightened her grip. The child still turned her head, her gaze forming an invisible line connecting the two women who had never met but shared the same shadow of truth pressing over their lives. Amina saw it clearly, felt it, hit her chest with a cold weight that deepened her breath. No shouting interrupted the moment, no sudden act of violence, only the spreading awareness, a haunting realization. Prejudice did not grow inside individuals on its own. It was taught, repeated, and passed down until people believed that staying silent in the face of injustice was the only way to stay safe. Amina drew in a long breath, not to escape emotion, but to hold on to clarity in the chaos about to erupt. She stood there, seeing herself in Lana and seeing her mother in Mira, a chain of women with her skin tone always standing at the fragile line between what was right and the fear pushed to its extreme. A light breeze brushed through the parking lot, lifting a thin layer of dust, and for a brief moment everything paused enough for Amina to understand that this confrontation was not just between her and Reed, but between two worlds colliding in front of Lana's eyes. She understood she was facing not only the aggression of one officer, but the ground he stood on, a ground that had pressed down on people like her countless times. The realization deepened Amina's gaze. It was no longer simply a response to Reed, but a warning about what lay beneath the child's innocent question. Lana had spoken the truth no adult dared to voice, and that truth moved through the crowd like a so-fat, sharp wind, making not just the parking lot, but even Amina herself feel the weight of how far this encounter had reached. The parking lot felt as if a hollow had been carved into the air after Lana's question. Eyes had barely shifted from the mother and child before snapping back to Reed and Amina when Reed suddenly roared, his voice hidden like metal striking stone. His aggression, already obvious, now erupted violently after Amina deflected his hand in front of the crowd. "You dare disrespect me." Reed lunged, his face burning with anger and humiliation as if her simple deflection had struck directly at his already wounded pride. His voice was hoarse from holding back rage, each word forced through clenched teeth, like a threat meant to crush anyone's composure. Amina looked straight at him without stepping back or turning away, her gaze deep and cold enough to drive Reed further into frenzy. "You do not deserve respect." Her voice cut through the heat like a blade, sharp and clear enough to make several onlookers draw a sharp breath. Reed's face darkened for an instant, his eyes flashing with a dangerous spark like an animal pushed past reason. Cole flinched behind him, stunned. He had never heard anyone speak to Reed like that, nor seen him react with such volatile fury. The murmurs in the crowd stopped abruptly when Reed charged. He no longer hid his rage. His movement was brutal and heavy as he swung his arm straight toward Amina's face, the strike carrying clear intent to harm far beyond anything an officer on duty could justify. In that moment, sunlight flared white, and everything seemed to slow in a single breath. Amina tilted her head by just the right margin to avoid the blow Reed had thrown with full strength. She grounded her stance and turned her body, reacting with the trained instinct of someone who had faced danger countless times before. Before Reed could regain his balance or launch another attack, her arm swept up and locked around his elbow joint, precise as a motion drilled thousands of hours in the dim training rooms of combat facilities. Reed stumbled, his weight pulled off center, his foot hitting the concrete hard, while Amina's hold stayed firm, leaving him unable to regain control. The hold was not strong enough to break anything, only controlled and measured, designed to stop an attacker without causing injury. That restraint alone told any trained observer this was not a reflex born of panic. It was technique, high-level technique, the kind taught to someone with real combat training. Reed struggled inside the lock, his breath breaking into frantic bursts, his teeth grinding like stone on stone, while his face shifted from red to purple with rage and the pressure restraining him. Cole stood nearby in shock, his eyes wide as if witnessing the impossible. "She is not normal," he muttered, his voice shaky with fear and awe. The onlookers were just as stunned. They had seen Reed attack Amina, but the way she locked him down clean and precise left many holding their breath in disbelief. Walter Briggs, who had been watching silently from a few steps back, narrowed his eyes. He had been a police officer for nearly 4 decades, had lived through countless unpredictable turns, had seen many people confront officers in every possible way, but very few possessed the refined, controlled combat skill Amina displayed. He stepped forward, half a pace, his gaze cutting straight into the hold she was applying. "You are..." Walter paused, his eyes widening slightly as if the truth had just clicked into place, Navy SEAL right. Walter's words stirred the crowd even more than Reed's earlier shouting. A wave of emotion moved through them, not because they all understood exactly what a Navy SEAL was, but because of the way he said it. The weight behind each word, enough for anyone to sense it, meant something far bigger than what they were seeing. Cole snapped his head toward Walter, confusion flooding his expression, while Reed continued struggling helplessly in Amina's hold, breathing hard through his nose like a bull, cornered and out of control. Amina did not answer Walter and did not look around for confirmation. confirmation. She kept the hold steady, neither too tight nor too loose. Her hair clung slightly to her forehead from the heat, and her breathing remained even despite the tension gripping the scene. Every movement she made was deliberate, without tremor, without hesitation or fear, showing only the absolute control of someone who knew her own strength and understood the importance of restraint. The crowd erupted into whispers. Some lifted their phones higher to record more clearly. Others pulled friends closer so they would not miss what was happening. Their eyes dug into the truth Amina still had not confirmed, but the truth was already exposed in her movements, her reflexes, and the cold precision of the hold keeping Reed powerless. Walter stepped in even closer, his aging but sharp eyes fixed on Amina with a mix of astonishment and respect. He recognized what most people watching would not grasp immediately. This was a technique impossible to achieve without the highest level of training. And what stunned him was not that Amina defended herself, but that she kept total control even after being attacked publicly in front of dozens of witnesses. Reed tried to surge again, but the force he used collapsed against her hold, nearly throwing him off balance. His face flushed the vein at his temple, twitching violently, and he growled from deep in his throat, unable to accept being restrained by a woman in front of so many people. But everyone could see he could not break free. His body jolted with every attempt, yet Amina held firm like a pillar planted in the scorching ground. The silence after Walter spoke created a strange pause in the crowd. It did not last long, but it was enough for everyone to understand that this event had shifted to another level. A level where Reed was no longer simply a police officer and Amina was no longer just a woman ordered out of her car. Their confrontation had transformed, revealing a deeper layer no one in the parking lot had anticipated. Silence fell over the parking lot after Walter Briggs's question, as if the entire space had been stretched even tighter. Amina held the lock steady, her body balanced with each breath, while Reed thrashed like an animal cornered with no way out. The question, "You are Navy SEAL right," rang loudly enough for even those farthest away to shade their eyes and squint for clarity. Every whisper paused, every gaze converged on Amina, as if a single nod from her would rewrite the entire scene. Amina did not speak. Her breathing stayed even, her wrist maintaining firm control on Reed's elbow joint. She slowly turned her face toward Walter, each movement controlled and cold. Then she gave a nod so small anyone not watching closely would miss it. Yet, in the air stretched so tight that even the wind seemed to slice between cars, that subtle nod struck like thunder at noon. Eyes widened. Someone gasped. A few hands flew to mouths. One voice broke out, "Oh my God," then fell silent. In that quiet moment, a tiny movement from Amina shifted everything completely. From inside the fold of her collar, a small metal object slipped to the concrete landing with a sharp, dry clink that echoed far louder than its size. A small woman nearby, her hair tied back and her posture slight instinctively bent down to pick it up. It was Nina, who had walked out of the store minutes earlier. Sunlight hit the metal in her palm, making it flash. Nina examined it closely, her eyes widening. This is a real SEAL trident." Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from shock. She turned the insignia over in her hand, her expression shifting as she tried to piece together what she knew with what she was witnessing. Reed heard her and reacted as if struck at the base of the skull. He jerked violently, trying to twist free, but was trapped in Amina's hold. Even so, he reached with his free hand and snatched the metal from Nina, desperate, like a man trying to deny reality. "Give it here," he barked, his voice hoarse and cracking. Nina flinched and released it into his hand. Reed stared down at it, his eyes shrinking, his fingertips trembling with each breath. No way," he whispered, his whole body swaying as if all the blood had drained out of him. His words sounded like a panicked confession. The insults he had hurled, the aggression he had unleashed, all settled over him like dust from a mistake impossible to deny. He looked at the insignia again, his expression shifting from disbelief to fear. fear. The fear flowed over his features, warping them, born partly from shame and partly from the realization that he had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Amina stayed silent. She released the hold and pushed Reed's arm lightly, forcing him to stumble back a step. Reed moved unsteadily, like someone unsure where to place his feet. No more shouting, no more inflated breaths of someone trying to dominate. The whispers around them grew louder, swirling through the noise of passing traffic. A man in the crowd muttered, "If that is a real SEAL insignia, he is done." A woman pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes filled with both sympathy for Amina and anger over what she had endured. Amina stepped forward and faced Reed directly. No defensive stance, no guarded distance. She stood taller, with the posture of someone who knew she did not need to prove anything. Reed lifted his head to look at her, his eyes trembling as though every blink risked exposing more of his fear. Cole stood behind him, his face drained of color. He looked from the insignia in Reed's hand to Amina, and in his eyes appeared a respect no one expected. If it is real," Cole whispered. What he did not say was that if it was real, the situation had gone far beyond repair. Amina looked at Reed, her voice cold and sharp. "You can verify it." The words fell like a declaration, not loud, but strong and clear enough to make several people hold their breath. And after that, she continued her tone, lower in a degree, each word firm and deliberate, as if placing stone after stone into a reality Reed could no longer deny. "Prepare yourselves for the consequences." Reed's face drained to a sickly pale. Cole stood frozen, unable to believe what was unfolding. Nina stepped back, her hands trembling as she looked at the space between Amina and the two officers. The onlookers stayed silent for a long second before whispers broke out again. "A real SEAL. She is Special Forces. He will be investigated for sure." What was he thinking? Reed swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as if he were choking on his own arrogance. He looked at the insignia once more, then at Amina. His eyes no longer held hostility, only fear mixed with regret and shock. Every action he had taken, from walking up to her car, slamming his hand on the window, hurling insults, and then attacking her now, played back in his mind like footage he could never erase. Amina broke eye contact and turned toward the crowd. The witnesses watched in silence, some holding their phones high, some having recorded since the beginning. She understood exactly what the moment meant. There was no undoing the truth. It stood in the center of the parking lot under the harsh sun, on the heated ground where the SEAL Trident had first fallen. In that moment, Reed realized that Amina's small nod had not only answered Walter, it had answered him his arrogance and the entire abuse of authority he believed he could get away with, as always. But this time was different. This time he had picked the wrong person. Someone he could not intimidate. Someone he could not overpower. Someone whose truth he could not bend. And Amina, with a gaze so cold and deep it forced the crowd to hold its breath, had just shown him exactly that. The sound of the insignia hitting the concrete still echoed in the minds of the crowd as everything shifted. Eyes darted between Amina Reed and the small piece of metal trembling in his hand. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood this moment had crossed a line that could not be undone. While Reed stumbled back, pale with rising terror at the outer edge of the gathering circle, Evan Morales lifted his phone a little higher, his finger trembling as he tapped to start the live stream. Evan had not planned to record from the beginning. At first, he only watched with irritation, then started filming when Reed slammed his hand against Amina's window because something felt dangerously wrong. He never expected it to go this far. The vid-E, barely 2 minutes long and G, that he was now streaming carried the weight of a whole ton of truth. A truth strong enough that thousands of people within minutes would feel their chests tighten watching it unfold. While Reed stood swaying with the trident in his hand and Amina faced him with an almost chilling composure, Evan raised the phone higher to make sure everything was captured clearly. Wind swept across the lot, street noise echoed from afar, but the only only sounds the viewers heard were Evan's tense breathing and the murmurs from the crowd. Within only a few dozen seconds, his screen flashed the line 1.8 thousand watching. Evan glanced at it and nearly dropped his phone in shock. Comments poured in rapidly. What are the cops doing? Why are they trying to arrest someone in uniform? Wait, is that a real SEAL team? Did they just assault an actual SEAL? Please, film closer. This is getting big. The viewer count climbed exponentially like flames meeting wind. Evan no longer cared about the number. He could feel something far bigger than this parking lot spreading everywhere. Comments kept flooding the screen like a rushing stream of words. One viewer wrote, "He is going to prison," and another replied immediately, "If this is real, those two are finished." Then a comment appeared that made Evan's jaw drop. That insignia cannot be fake. She is Special Forces, no doubt. In the parking lot, the crowd drifted closer, not to interfere, but to see more clearly the truth unfolding before them. People were curious by nature, but this curiosity was fueled by a rising current of anger. They no longer looked at Amina like someone caught in a petty dispute. They now saw her as a black woman who was never the suspect but the victim of flagrant abuse of authority. Their eyes grew warmer, steadier, tinged with respect. A man from the back stepped forward a few paces, his voice ringing out like metal striking concrete. "Call higher authorities. Record everything." His shout startled Reed, and Cole looked around in confusion. The terror in Reed's eyes grew when he saw at least 6 people filming continuously, including 3 who were live streaming. Nina stayed nearby, her expression a mix of disbelief and anger as she looked at Amina and Reed. Across from her, Walter Briggs stood tall, chin raised, as if ready to face whatever reaction Reed might have. "Everyone is recording," a woman said sharply, her voice firm. "There is no denying anything now." She stared directly at Cole as if urging him to stop his partner before things got even worse. Cole inhaled deeply, fully aware that the situation had spun beyond their control. He did not intend to do anything wrong, but fear of Reed, fear of breaking the silence he had grown used to, made him passive. That passivity left him standing between 2 currents, unsure which direction was right. Yet, when Amina stood still with that calm, steady gaze, it seemed to shine straight into the part of Cole's conscience he thought he had buried. He began to realize that whichever side he chose, nothing would go back to how it was. Evan kept live streaming, and the viewer count had now surpassed 4,000. Comments exploded like fireworks. "I cannot believe a SEAL is being treated like this. This is insane. Only people who survive deadly missions earn that trident. Does that cop even know what he is doing? Someone call higher authorities right now." A young man near Evan leaned in and whispered, "Let me send this video to the community group. This is going to blow up." Evan did not respond, his eyes fixed on the screen because he knew the kid was right. The story had escaped the boundaries of this neighborhood. It was breaking into thousands of pieces and rising like bright dust specks that could reach anyone scrolling on their phone anywhere in the city. A woman in a floral blouse shouted from across the lot, her voice ringing like an emergency call. "Call higher authorities." She turned toward the crowd. "Someone has the number. Call now." Instantly, several people lifted their phones and began dialing. A middle-aged man pushed to the front, his lips pulled tight, his voice loud and furious. "Record everything. Get every second." No one needed to know exactly who Amina was to understand she did not deserve what was happening. No one needed extensive military knowledge to see that Reed had crossed far beyond the limits of a police officer's authority. The calls and the stares showed a clear shift within the crowd. They were no longer on Reed's side. They were standing with Amina, even though she had not explained anything about herself. Reed looked around and saw every pair of eyes fixed on him, phones held high like dozens of living witnesses capturing his mistakes from every angle. He clenched the metal insignia until his knuckles turned white. The fear building in his face grew more visible by the second, exposing a shift inside him that he could no longer control. Amina stepped back 1 pace space, just enough to maintain space between her and Reed. Nothing in her movement was threatening. It was only a quiet reminder that the balance of power was shifting back to where it belonged. Someone in the crowd looked at Amina, then at Reed, the comparison forming instantly in their minds. One side was calm, disciplined, and controlled. The other was hostile, frantic, and collapsing under its own fear. The live stream kept running the line 6.3 thousand watching glowing across Evan's screen, while on the other side of that glass rectangle, Lee, the real story, continued to unfold, spreading from the hot breaths in the parking lot to the thousands of eyes now watching through their phones. At the police station, the duty room, usually noisy with radio chatter, keyboard clicks, and routine exchanges, had become chaotic in a very different way. Desk phones rang nonstop, each burst of sound piling on the next, as if the whole city had decided to call at once. A young officer hurried back and forth between desks, a clipboard in hand, eyes wide with tension. Another call from the press, he panted, and "Federal Command is demanding a report immediately." The moment those words left his mouth, the atmosphere in the room shifted, as if a cold draft had swept through. In the corner, the shift supervisor, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and the exhaustion of decades on the job written on his face, leaned over a computer screen. It was Evan Morales' live stream forwarded by a local reporter barely 5 minutes earlier. The screen's glow lit his features as the footage played, Reed shouting into Amina's face, Reed slamming his hand on her window, Reed charging at her and being locked down. Then, the moment the seal insignia glittered under the sun, each frame struck him like a needle to the temple. He swallowed hard, pulled the monitor closer, and paused the video on the exact shot of Reed pinned in Amina's hold, his face flushed red, eyes bulging. Another duty officer rushed up, holding out a ringing phone with both hands. "Sir, you need to take this. They say it is from Federal Command." The supervisor did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the frozen image on the monitor as though he were searching for a way out that he already knew did not exist. Finally, he tore his gaze away, inhaling deeply as if gathering his last piece of calm. "Reed," he muttered, letting out a long, defeated exhale. "Who did you think you were messing with?" The question was not meant for Reed to hear. It was the sigh of a man who knew this had gone far beyond anything a quick report could cover. He looked around the room and saw only stunned faces, shock rippling through officers who had never imagined something like this. Reed Harker had always been hot-headed, sometimes reckless, but no one believed he would lay hands on someone in uniform, especially the uniform of a Navy SEAL. And now the evidence sat right in front of them, irrefutable, unavoidable. Phones kept ringing, drowning out conversations. An officer handling incoming calls turned voice shaken. "The rumor has spread. Reporters are already heading here. They want to know what happened at the convenience store parking lot." Another officer added. The county office called. They saw the video online. A third chimed in. Civil rights groups are demanding answers immediately. The shift supervisor lifted his head, his eyes sweeping across the room as if searching for something solid to hold on to, but all he saw was chaos spreading like fire. He grabbed the radio on the desk, his voice firm like a man making a decision he knew could not be delayed. "Deploy the 2nd Patrol Unit to the scene immediately. Secure the area, protect civilians, and document every statement." He emphasized each word, his gaze sharpening. "And send a command vehicle. We need control before this gets out of hand." A young officer nodded, raising his radio to alert the patrol unit. Others moved quickly under the order, preparing vehicles, switching on emergency lights, and activating loudspeakers. The duty room shifted from confusion to urgent response, each person rushing to their task. Yet, no one stepped away without glancing at the video on the screen at least once more, as if confirming that what they saw truly happened. Meanwhile, El Reed and Cole had no idea how violently the station was erupting. They still stood under the harsh sun in the parking lot, surrounded by the eyes of civilians. Reed stared at the insignia in his hand as if staring long enough might turn it into something else, something that did not condemn him. "She resisted," he stammered, speaking partly to Amina, partly to the bystanders filming him and partly to himself. She attacked me first, but his words were weak and meaningless among the crowd, looking at him with a mix of outrage and disbelief. Cole stood slightly behind his head, bowed like someone carrying an invisible stone. He heard every word Reed said, but inside, he knew none of it was true. Amina had not attacked first. He had seen everything from the beginning. Reed was the one who initiated. Reed was the one who slammed the window. Reed was the one who insulted. Reed was the one who launched the first attack. Yet Cole stayed silent. Reed's excuse was not only wrong, but so flimsy that Cole felt shame on his behalf. Still, beneath the shame lived the old familiar fear. The fear that had kept him standing next to Reed for years. The fear that made him fold his arms through things he disagreed with but never had the courage to stop. In the parking lot, Amina stood tall, her eyes unshaken even as Reed tried to raise his voice to overpower the stares around him. She did not answer his false accusation. She did not need to. The truth was already visible to everyone. The people had witnessed it. The phones had recorded it. The livestream had spread it. Every action, every word, every slam of Reed's hand was now evidence. Back at the station, the shift supervisor pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to ease the weight pressing against his chest. He knew the country had endured too many cases of abuse of authority, too many incidents caught on camera, too many bursts of community outrage. And he knew this video, this live stream, would be another spark landing on an already full barrel. But unlike the others, this time, the victim was not just anyone. Amina was a Navy SEAL, one of the most elite forces, a force respected by both police and military, a force where any disrespect carried severe consequences. The phone rang again, but the shift supervisor did not pick it up. He turned to the officer, scrambling to silence it. "Log every call. Do not miss any." His voice was slow, clear. "This is going further than any of you think." Across the city, other patrol cars had already switched on their sirens, speeding down the streets toward the scene. Blue and red lights spun across the hot pavement, signaling that the small confrontation in the parking lot had grown into a major event, watched by hundreds of eyes in the duty room, thousands online, and every person standing there. And they were all following the same question, a question now too large to ignore. Who exactly had Reed Harker just confronted? The sound of approaching police sirens rolled in from the distance, each rising wail slicing through the scorching air of the parking lot. The crowd instantly turned toward the noise, many raising their phones higher to capture every moment. Blue and red lights swept across the pavement, stretching shadows long before shrinking them again, reflecting against the glass of the convenience store. One patrol car braked hard at the entrance, followed by a second, a third, then a specialized internal affairs vehicle with lights flashing but no siren, a sign that this situation had moved far beyond an ordinary call. The doors swung open. A commanding officer stepped out, uniform, crisp face, tight, with the expression of someone tasked with putting out a fire already raging out of control. Behind him came two internal affairs officers, their demeanor cold and serious, their eyes scanning the parking lot to take in the situation within seconds. The crowd shifted aside, forming a wide clearing around the space where everything had unfolded and where the next escalation was about to erupt. Amina stood at the center of that space, upright, her calm presence a stark contrast to Reed's trembling panic and Cole's heavy silence. The SEAL insignia remained in Reed's grip, his hand squeezing it so tightly the tendons stood out. When he saw the commanding officer approaching, color drained from his face, his lips quivering. Cole stood behind him with his head bowed and his fingers intertwined tightly like someone wishing he could disappear. The commanding officer looked at Amina first, his gaze pausing for a moment, enough to show recognition and respect. Then he turned to Reed and Cole. The shift in the air felt like a cold wind slicing through the burning heat. He moved forward, his voice projecting clearly without the need to shout. "Your guns and your badges, now!" Reed reacted as if struck. He opened his mouth, but only a choked, sound escaped like metal scraping stone. Wait, she resisted, but even he seemed to hear how weak and hollow his own words were. Cole lifted his head slightly at the claim, then dropped it again, unable to defend something he knew was false. The internal affairs officers stepped to either side and extended their hands according to protocol. Cole was approached first. He did not argue or resist. He simply pulled his gun from its holster with a heavy motion and placed it in the officer's hand. His badge followed its metallic shine, losing all authority as it left his chest. Reed stood frozen, sweat beading on his face. When an internal affairs officer reached out, he stepped back, still clutching the SEAL insignia as if it were a lifeline. Wait, he did not finish. The commanding officer stepped in closer, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the space between them. You assaulted a Navy SEAL. This is criminal conduct, not a procedural mistake. Hand over your weapon. One sentence drained every breath from Reed's lungs. He looked down at the insignia in his hand, then at Amina, then at the commanding officer. His entire body trembled as if reality were collapsing faster than he could brace for it. An internal affairs officer tightened his grip on Reed's forearm, not harshly but firmly enough to remind him he had no choice. Reed drew his gun from the leather holster, his hand shaken so badly that the weapon tapped against the holster's clasp with a small but unmistakable sound in the silence. His badge was removed right after the motion, clean and merciless. When Reed was ordered to place both items into the officer's hands, the murmurs in the crowd swelled into a wave. A middle-aged woman covered her mouth, eyes wide in disbelief. A young man pushed his phone closer, recording every second. A man near the store entrance nodded hard as if justice had finally remembered its duty. Reed looked at the SEAL insignia one last time, then released it into the officer's palm as if letting go of the final scrap of arrogance he had clung to from the start. He stood motionless, eyes on the ground, breath fractured. I did not know, he stammered in desperation. No one answered him. Cole stood, frozen, face drained, hands shaken in the way of someone who understood that every protective door around him had just slammed shut. When the two internal affairs officers turned Reed around to escort him away, the crowd moved with a release of emotion they had held back since the beginning. One person clapped first. The sharp, clear sound struck the air and spread like fire racing across paper. Within seconds, the entire parking lot was clapping. Someone shouted, "That is right." Another called out, "Take their statements. Everything is recorded." Someone cried, someone squeezed the hand of the person beside them as if they had just witnessed something they had waited years to see. Reed was led away between the two officers, head bowed, his police insignia gone from his chest like a strip of skin torn off. Cole followed, not handcuffed, but carrying the look of a man completely undone. He did not look at the crowd, at Amina, or at Reed. His eyes seemed forced toward an empty space where he finally had to face the truth that he had stood on the wrong side for far too long. Amina watched the scene in silence. Not proud, not angry, not relieved. Her eyes held only the quiet steadiness of someone who had seen enough confrontations to know that justice, even when late, could still find its rightful place if enough light reached it. The crowd continued applauding as the officers escorted Reed across the lot. Those claps were not for Reed's fall, but for what they had just witnessed, a moment when truth was not bent by power. When the internal affairs vehicle shut its doors and rolled away, the air in the lot slowed. The applause faded into the wind, the sun still bright, but somehow softer. People gradually turned their cameras toward Amina, not as a victim, but as someone who had stood firm through the storm. She had asked for nothing yet. They lowered their phones and nodded at her, offering the respect they knew she deserved. The sound of the internal affairs vehicle door closing as Reed and Cole were taken away still hung in the air when the parking lot began to shift in tone. The extreme tension from before was replaced by a different current, quiet but deep, like a breeze brushing across a lake after a storm. People were no longer clapping, but everyone remained where they were, watching Amina with eyes filled with respect and gratitude. They stayed silent, not out of fear, but because they sensed the moment carried a weight far beyond a confrontation between civilians and police. This was a turning point where truth had been laid bare under the noon sun as a command no one could ignore. Within the circle of people that had yet to disperse, Amina stood tall, her breathing steady, just as it had been when she first stepped out of her vehicle. She felt no triumph, no urge to boast about the powerful shift truth had delivered. That calmness only deepened the respect of those around her. In her tone, they saw not anger, but the strength of someone who had long understood the need for composure to survive missions where danger was constant. It was that composure that made people want to approach her to say something even if they did not know how to begin. A sand-colored military vehicle pulled up near the newly cleared row of cars. Its door opened and a man in high-ranking uniform stepped out, his posture firm, his eyes sharp and bright like tempered steel. He advanced without hurry, yet every step was deliberate, carrying the aura of someone used to commanding entire teams in missions where mistakes could not exist. He was the commander of the SEAL unit to which Amina belonged. Amina saw him from a distance, straightening instinctively as any soldier would, but without tension. The commander reached her, stopping at a distance that formed a respectful space between two service members. His gaze held no suspicion, no searching. It was the look of someone who had known the truth from the moment he saw the video. He spoke slowly but firmly, each word carrying the weight of a confirmation no one around them ever imagined they would hear in person. "We stand with you." The words pulled the air still like silence, ceremonial drumming. Keys they'd shifted collectively, some placing hands over their hearts, some whispering in awe. They did not know much about the military, but they understood that a statement from a SEAL commander was never empty. And "we stand with you" was absolute validation for the woman standing in the center of the parking lot. Amina looked directly at him, her eyes softening for one brief beat before settling back into their steady seriousness. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her voice soft but carrying far enough for all to hear. The commander placed a hand on her shoulder, a light touch with the force of a vow. Then he stepped back to allow Amina to turn toward the crowd that waited for her. Phones were still raised. News cameras had appeared from somewhere, followed by people running from the sidewalk toward the parking lot. A few reporters who had just arrived powered on their cameras, instantly aiming their lenses straight at Amina without a single pause. Everyone stood still, no one pushing forward, as if they all understood Amina needed space to say something they had not yet heard, but all were waiting for. Amina looked around. Her face wasn't rigid or defensive the way it had been when confronting Reed. It was calm, but not cold. There was a faint sadness in her eyes, like someone who had seen a familiar cycle, yet hoped this time it could end. She inhaled, steadying her breath before she spoke. "I just want justice." Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't pushed to echo, but the simplicity of the way she said it made every person in the crowd hear it more clearly than any loudspeaker. The justice she meant wasn't only for herself. The people knew that. They saw in those words a piece of the answer to the injustices they had witnessed, feared, and wanted to oppose, but had stayed silent about to avoid trouble. And as Amina stood there in the center of the circle, saying it without provocation or hatred, they understood she was speaking for hundreds who never had the chance to speak at all. A middle-aged woman stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly. Are you all right?" she asked without hesitation. The question triggered more from every direction. "Are you hurt? Should we call someone for you? Do you need water? Do you want us to testify?" Amina responded with a small, honest smile, neither embellished nor forced. "I'm all right." She spoke like someone who had survived far worse, but didn't dismiss the concern shown to her. Her smile made a few people tear up, not out of pity, but pride. Then the specialized lights of news crews switched on. A reporter near the edge of the crowd shouted, "Please, Keep the scene clear. Camera shutters snapped in quick bursts, flashes firing repeatedly. Other reporters pushed to the rim of the circle, holding their microphones toward Amina, firing questions in rapid succession. What message do you want to send? How do you think the police will respond? Are you worried about your safety? Amina didn't answer right away. The commander stepped forward half a pace like a shield between her and the press. But Amina gently lifted her hand, signaling that she was fine, then turned to look at the cameras pointed at her. The white lights washed over her face, creating an image those present would never forget. A soldier, a black woman standing in the center of a storm of injustice and justice, still as steady as a tree facing the wind. At last, she said, "This story is not about me. It is about how we treat one another, about what we allow, and what we can no longer stay silent about." The words didn't ring out to please anyone, but struck like a firm knock against the consciousness of everyone watching. The press captured every moment, every expression, every shade in her voice, and those images only minutes later began appearing in breaking news threads spreading onto major platforms. More live streams were shared and dozens of new videos were posted from different angles. The story exploded across the country faster than the flash of light that reflected off the seal insignia when it fell. And Amina, in her calm, understood that this was only the beginning of a larger conversation that the entire society would have to face. Inside the police department's interrogation room, the white lights cast a cold sheen across the metal table. Beyond the frosted glass, officers walking past still murmured about the explosion of events earlier that afternoon, while inside the air was so heavy that every breath Reed and Cole took sounded like scraping steel. They had been separated into 2 rooms, ordered to surrender all personal belongings, and left to sit in a silence thick enough to choke on. Reed sat rigid, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale, his face darkened by anger, but streaked with an unmistakable fear. Cole, in the adjoining room, leaned forward with his head nearly touching the table, his shoulders trembling like someone who had just lost the only foundation he had relied on throughout his entire career. The only steady sound was the soft tapping of a pen against the table as the investigator reviewed his note. The door opened, and 2 internal affairs investigators stepped inside. They did not hurry, but the calmness they carried pressed heavier than any bright overhead light. The lead investigator placed a thick folder on the table in front of Reed, opening it to the first page. Still images from the video, each frame as clear as a stamped piece of evidence. Reed glanced once, then turned away, chest rising and falling like a man trapped in a shrinking cage. "We will begin with Officer Brent Cole," the investigator said, his voice low but sharp as a blade. Another investigator retrieved Cole from the next room. Cole sat, hands linked together, in the nervous habit he had never quite broken. The investigator looked directly at him, avoiding any preamble. "Officer Cole, we have watched the video, all of it. We want your statement." Cole swallowed his throat, bobbing with the effort, revealing the turmoil between fear, guilt, and a need to finally speak the truth after years of silence. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse but steady. I did not want things to go that far." He paused, still staring at the table. "Reed pushed me into it. I wanted to stop from the beginning." The words fell like a stone into cold water, sending ripples instantly through the room. Reed shot up from his chair, the metal legs screeching across the tile. "What did you say?" he shouted, his voice cracking like splitting stone. The investigator lifted a hand for calm, but Reed ignored it, yelling louder. "I never pushed you. You saw it." She resisted. "You saw it." Cole did not look at him. He drew a long breath, his shoulders curling as if gathering the last bit of courage he possessed. "I told you to stop from the moment you hit her window." Another pause, his voice softening under the weight of exhaustion. "You did not listen." Reed let out a short, bitter laugh, the kind that cut like a sharpened edge. "Because I was right. People like her in uniform are suspicious. You can tell just by looking." He slammed his hand onto the table, the folder snapping upward with the force. "We followed the procedure. She disobeyed orders. The investigator, shot to his feet. His chair slammed into the wall with a crash so sharp that Cole flinched. He walked straight toward Reed, entirely unmoved by the man's aggression. "What did you just say?" His voice dropped low, not loud, but heavy enough to freeze the entire room. Reed stiffened his mouth, still open, but no sound came out. The investigator continued each word, dropping like a hammer. "You just admitted to racial discrimination in front of internal affairs." The air in the room drained out as if someone had opened a vacuum. Cole's mouth parted as though he wanted to speak, but stopped himself. Reed stood frozen in a rare moment of absolute stillness. All his anger, all the weak excuses he had clung to until now evaporated in an instant. The investigator placed both hands on the table and leaned forward, his gaze sharp enough to cut through metal. "Do you understand the consequences of that? This is not about suspension. This is not just losing your gun and badge. You just tied yourself to charges of abuse of authority and intentional assault with a racial motive." Reed swallowed hard, sweat gathering at his temples. His hands trembled visibly, clenching and unclenching, while his eyes darted around like a man drowning with no surface in sight. Cole stared at the table, his palms cold and damp. The investigator dragged his chair back into place and sat calm again, as though he had never raised his voice. He flipped to the next page of the file and set his pen down. "Continue," he said. "We will record every statement, and all of it will go to court." Cole nodded slightly, his voice cracking under the weight of fear and guilt. I was afraid to go against Reed. I knew he was wrong, but," he hesitated, "I was too scared." Reed burst out as though clinging to the last shred of power he had left. "Do not put this on me. You did everything too. You hit the car. You—" The investigator cut him off instantly. "Sit down." His tone was cold as steel. Reed obeyed without thinking, sinking into the chair with a loud scrape. The truth lay exposed on the table, every detail and every word binding them to the incident in a way neither could escape. Reed still thrashed for justification, while Cole confronted a regret deep enough to swallow him whole. Two men who once stood on the same side were now in opposite worlds. One clung to warped reasoning to shield himself. The other finally saw how his silence had let everything spiral beyond repair. The investigator looked at both of them, his eyes stern but not cruel, only carrying the gravity of someone who had witnessed far too many abuses of power. "You will both be held accountable," he said, firm and final. Out in the hallway, the footsteps of reporters, attorneys, and commanding officers echoed louder and louder, signaling that this investigation would not remain within four walls. And Reed, despite his forced composure, understood that the investigator's words had already carved his fate like the final stroke of ink on a conviction. The city's administrative building glowed with bright lights even in the late afternoon. The large meeting room on the third floor, usually reserved for urgent sessions, was now packed with representatives from the military, the police, the mayor's office, internal affairs, and federal legal counsel. The air was heavy and dense, as if every sound, no matter how small, fell onto the long wooden table with weight. At the head of that table, the military flag and the police flag stood side by side, but no one in the room saw them as symbols of unity. There was no unity today. Today was a confrontation. Reed and Cole were escorted in under tight supervision, two internal affairs officers shadowing them closely. Reed walked with a stubborn stiffness he had not yet let go of, though his face had paled after the interrogation. Cole moved like a man who had lost all bearings, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet the gaze of colleagues he had known for years. On the opposite side of the room, Amina sat with her SEAL commander and two military legal representatives. She wore her uniform crisp and immaculate, her posture straight, her expression calm but not gentle. She did not look at Reed or Cole as they entered. She did not need to. The entire room would do that for her. Once everyone was seated, the chair of the Interagency Inquiry Council rose to his feet. He was the only person in the room who managed to keep a perfectly neutral expression, revealing nothing beyond the gravity of someone about about to state what everyone had been waiting for. "We will begin," he said, his voice low and heavy, pulling the entire room beneath a focused beam of attention. The lights dimmed slightly. A large screen behind the table flickered on, casting a blue glow across the walls and the faces around the room. Silence fell as the words appeared: evidence extraction, live stream, store, camera, witness recordings. The first video to play was Evan Morales' live stream. The room seemed to sink into a deeper layer of stillness. No one spoke, no one even breathed loudly as Reed appeared on the screen, shouting into Amina's face in the scorching parking lot. The moment he slammed his hand into the car window made several people tense. When he grabbed Amina by the collar, a female officer at the end of the table gripped her chair. Then came the takedown, the seal insignia hitting the ground. The crowd, recording Reed's expression, collapsing as reality hit him like a sentence. Nothing was cut, nothing was softened. The truth unfolded without mercy. Then came the footage from the convenience store's camera. The higher angle showed everything even more clearly. Reed and Cole approaching Amina, Reed pounding the window, Reed shouting slurs, Reed attacking first and Amina responding with controlled, precise self-defense. The entire room watched Reed charge like an enraged animal, while Amina held her ground like solid stone, using not a single motion beyond what was necessary to protect herself. Everything Reed had claimed during the interrogation dissolved like smoke before undeniable evidence. When the screen finally went dark, no one spoke. No one needed to. The silence itself was the verdict. The SEAL representative rose to his feet. The tall man in the sand-colored uniform placed his hand on the table, his gaze sharp like steel forged in fire. He did not need to look at documents. He did not need preparation. Everything he was about to say was truth carved into the military record that had followed Amina for nearly half her life. Amina Rowe served 12 years in the Navy SEALs. He began, his voice deep like metal striking stone. She participated in 6 classified operations, received 3 commendations for rescuing teammates from life-threatening situations. Her record is immaculate. Her teamwork, discipline, and sacrifice exceed the standards any force would be proud of. He paused, letting his eyes sweep across Reed and Cole. "And she," he continued, his voice sharpening, "deserves far more respect than any of the words I heard from the 2 police officers today." A senior police official across the table, representing Reed and Cole's department, swallowed hard. He had watched the video. He had heard Reed's statements during interrogation. And now, seeing a SEAL representative publicly stand for Amina, he understood this was no longer a neighborhood incident. This was a national one. The council chair signaled. An internal affairs attorney stood open to file and listed each charge in the cold rustle of turning pages. After reviewing all evidence, he said, his voice hitting the room like hammer strikes. The council concludes that the actions of Officer Reed Harker and Officer Brent Cole include abuse of authority while on duty, assault on a person who posed no threat, obstruction of an active service member, and notably testimony and evidence confirming a clear racial motive behind the violence. A few police officers lowered their gazes, unable to hide their shame. Cole closed his eyes, his shoulders dropping like a rope slipping from a post. Reed bit his lower lip hard enough to draw blood, but he could not form a single word. He was defeated in thought and in fact. The attorney continued, his tone steady and heavy. Both officers will face criminal prosecution under federal law. Their conduct represents a severe violation of departmental policy, an infringement of Amina Rowe's civil rights, and a threat to the safety of a service member performing her duties. The SEAL representative inclined his head, not in surprise, but as if confirming justice was moving in the proper direction. The council chair nodded. The Interagency Inquiry Council is unanimous. He closed the file with a final deliberate motion. Officers Reed Harker and Brent Cole will face an upcoming federal trial. No one in the room breathed deeply. The shame belonged to Reed and Cole. The respect belonged to Amina. And the weight in the room spread like ripples, reminding everyone present of a truth that could no longer be denied. A uniform cannot shield the wrong person once the light is pointed at the truth. The federal court morning opened under a heaviness as thick as fog. The courtyard that was usually quiet had turned into a gathering ground for media, citizens, and social organizations. Signs reading, "Reform. The police now. No one is above the law. Justice for Amina" were held high above the murmur of the crowd waiting for the verdict. Nearby reporters held microphones and cameras aimed at the steps, ready to capture every moment. Close to the main doors, Amina stood with her attorney and the SEAL representatives, her face calm, but her eyes sharp, not out of pride, but out of the resolve of someone stepping into a final confrontation after days of pressure. When Reed and Cole were escorted out of the police vehicle, the crowd rose into a wave of whispers. Reed kept his head down, but the tension in his jaw showed he was clinging to the last scraps of dignity. His wrists were cuffed, and the uniform that once served as his shield, now stripped of all authority, made him look exposed and stripped of any power. Cole walked beside him, uncuffed yet pale, his expression hollow, like a man who had lost too much in too short a time. He did not look at the crowd, nor did he dare glance toward Amina. The hearing took place in the main courtroom, where light from the tall windows fell across the benches reserved for the arbiters of justice. The judge entered, bringing with him a solemn hush that draped over the room like a blanket before a storm. Reed and Cole were placed at the defendant's table. For several tense seconds, no one spoke. No one needed to. Everyone present had seen the video, heard the statements, and witnessed the truth laid bare. The verdict was no longer a question, only a moment waiting to be pronounced. The prosecutor rose first, reading the charges in a voice that carried without needing volume. Each sentence hit in the wooden panels like a solid blow. He detailed each act committed by Reed and Cole, from abuse of authority, assault, intimidation, to deliberate racial motivation. Reed did not lift his head, his hands gripping the table's edge. But when the prosecutor reached the part concerning Amina, especially when he emphasized a service member of an elite national force, Reed's eyes trembled, revealing the collapse of everything he once believed he could control. Cole's attorney stood next, speaking in a lower tone, attempting to argue for leniency by stating Cole had not directly attacked Amina, that he was swayed by Reed, and that he did not intend harm. But Cole himself shattered that plan when he stood in the middle of the defense, his voice shaken but clear. I take responsibility. I saw it was wrong and still didn't stop." He looked at the judge, then at Amina, his eyes full of remorse. "I stood on the wrong side, and I'll face the consequences." Amina sat in the back, neither nodding nor reacting strongly. Her silence was an angry bootoot, the understanding she had long carried that justice must come from truth, not from hatred. Her upright posture made several people in the room glance her way, as if her presence alone grounded the hearing, keeping it from tipping into emotion and maintaining the firmness it required. Finally, the judge spoke. He recited the charges once more before announcing the ruling under the taut, wire-tight attention of everyone present. "Officer Reed Harker, the court orders you held in custody pending formal trial and recommends full prosecution of all charges, including abuse of authority, assaulting a service member, and racial discrimination." Reed shut his eyes, his breath catching as if struck. The judge turned to Cole. "Officer Brent Cole is placed under supervision and required to undergo professional ethics review, and he will be held legally accountable for his role as an accomplice." When the words "permanent revocation of police authority" were read, the room seemed to hold its breath at once. Reed's shoulders collapsed as if someone had driven a blow down his spine. Cole closed his eyes, letting a breath slip out like a man admitting that the last door of his career had finally closed. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted. Some shouted as though releasing a weight they had carried since the moment they watched the first video. A group held signs reading, "No tolerance for abuse of power." Many began chanting for police reform, each shout like a drumbeat against the courthouse walls. Reporters pushed into the clusters of people, capturing every expression on the faces of the demonstrators. The atmosphere was not blind rage, but the awakening of a community after too many days of watching injustice. They could no longer remain silent. Amina exited the courthouse with the SEAL representatives, her face still calm. A reporter rushed up asking what she thought about the potential compensation that might be offered after the incident. She paused, looking toward the crowd, chanting in the distance, then answered in a low but steady voice without a tremor. "I want justice, not money." The words were neither a slogan nor a line crafted for the public. They were simply the truth of someone who did not need material repayment for injuries done to her dignity and humanity. An older woman stepped forward and gently held Amina's hand. "Thank you," she said, eyes glistening. "You did what many of us never dared to do." Amina only nodded, claiming no credit. She understood that the power of this moment did not come from who she was, but from the truth seen by thousands. As she descended the courthouse steps, sunlight caught the folds of her uniform, reflecting like a reminder that honor is not something handed to a person, but something preserved through action. And today, her actions had clarified what many had long questioned, whether justice could truly stand when the opponent was power itself. The afternoon slid across the SEAL base in deep golden light, stretching over the wide training grounds where the sea wind carried a faint salt scent across the steel-roofed buildings. Familiar sounds echoed from afar, the thud of boots on flooring, the clatter of metal, and the sharp commands of instructors. But the moment Amina stepped through the security gate, those sounds seemed to slow, as if the base itself were holding its breath to observe the woman returning from a battle without guns or explosions yet as heavy as any confrontation beyond the battlefield. A group of young recruits jogging by eased their pace when they saw her. They turned, fully eyes filled with respect. At the far corner, a platoon in firearms training paused mid-drill and lowered their weapons. And as Amina moved deeper into the central compound, the place where she had spent most of her youth honing herself, familiar faces began to emerge. Her teammates, one by one, stepped out from the tactical room, the range the weapons check area, as though they had known she would return today. No one cheered. SEALs had their own way of showing pride, quiet and far stronger than any shout. Her commander, who stood beside her earlier that morning in the interagency hearing, crossed his arms and watched her with steady, warm eyes. Beside him stood the teammates closest to her, the ones who had shared missions, dawns and nights, places where life and death were separated by only a few missteps. One of them, Malik Jordan, tall with deep brown eyes and a scar running along his jawbone, stepped forward. He did not congratulate her, did not clap her shoulder, did not offer anything showy. He simply stood before her, met her gaze, and gave a small nod. "Welcome back," Amina answered with a thin but sincere smile. She was long accustomed to such simplicity. For them, a few words were not a sign of coldness, but a sign that everything that needed saying had already been proven through action. After Malik, the others approached in their own ways. One grasped her wrist in a firm shake. Another touched her shoulder lightly. Another stood next to her in silence, a wordless vow that she would never face difficult moments alone. A younger teammate, Cara Lynn, who had gone through life and death with Amina during their last operation in the eastern waters, stepped up. Her voice was clear yet hard. "You're never alone." The statement made several others nod subtly, as if Cara had spoken for all of them, saying what they wanted to say, but were not as good at putting into words. Amina breathed slowly, warmth rising in her chest at the welcome that needed no ceremony, yet carried the strength of an oath. "I only did what was right," she said, her voice quiet but firm, as though to affirm that her steady confrontation with Reed had not been an achievement but a responsibility of someone wearing the uniform. But those surrounding her understood that sometimes what is right was the hardest thing of all, especially when the adversary was abuse of power rather than an enemy she knew how to fight on the battlefield. Her commander, the man whose silver hair caught the late afternoon light, stepped forward. He did not look at Amina the way a superior looks at a subordinate, but as someone who had shared dangers too complex to put into words. "Here," he said, his voice low, "you don't have to carry everything alone." He glanced at the people standing in a circle around her. "The entire team will stand with you any time you need." A soft breeze moved through the courtyard, stirring the seal flag on its high pole. Amina felt something shift in her chest, as though a bruise inside her had just been wrapped by the quiet presence of those who understood the silent battle she had come through. Reed was not the enemy she wanted to face, but he represented something larger, deeper rooted in society, far beyond anything a training facility could prepare her for. A group of young recruits stepped closer, their eyes bright as they looked at Amina like she was a living symbol. One of them, likely new to the unit, stared with the awe of someone seeing for the first time what real steadiness looked like in the face of a storm. "Ma'am," he said softly, "your video has spread across the base." Several people behind him let out quiet, knowing laughs, not mocking but acknowledging that everyone here was well aware of what had happened. Malik looked from the young recruit back to Amina, his eyes firm. "Everyone's seen it," he said, "and we stand with you completely." The statement made the faces around them nod in a slow, unified rhythm, not loud but resolute. A few stepped even closer, as if forming an invisible barrier around her, a barrier built from loyalty and unshakable camaraderie. Amina looked around, taking in the air of the place she had called home for years. This was not a battlefield, but it was where she had learned to face danger of all kinds, even the kind that wore the shape of people holding power. She stepped forward once, letting the sound of her boot on concrete carry. She looked at her teammates one by one and spoke softly, clearly, "Thank you, all of you. I know I'm not alone." No one answered right away, but the silence carried more weight than 100 reassuring words. It was the SEAL's way of making a promise. If she walked into darkness, they would stand at her back. If she faced unjust voices, they would speak beside her. And if she continued on the path of justice she had chosen, they would be her foundation unshaken. Amina stood in the center of that circle, the last light of day outlining her features, making her look like someone returning to where she truly belonged, not after a victory, but after a battle where truth was the only weapon she chose. And in a place where these people had sworn never to abandon one another, she knew this was only the beginning of something longer and heavier, but this time an entire team stood behind her. In the days after the hearing, Amina's name appeared across newspapers and evening broadcasts, but amid all the noise, she chose a quiet afternoon to walk into the neighborhood community elementary school where she had been invited to speak to students about courage and fairness. The small school sat behind rows of golden maple trees, its iron gate open as if welcoming new footsteps, and at the front of the courtyard stood several teachers waiting with warm smiles. There were no cameras, no chanting crowds, only stillness, and the curious eyes of children watching the woman who had stood firm against injustice. Amina stepped into the small auditorium where more than 100 students sat neatly on a sea-blue carpet. Bright eyes stared up at the stage, and a few children nudged their friends after recognizing her from the video their parents had watched repeatedly over the past few days. As she approached the podium, the only sound in the room was a soft hum of excitement. Today, she wasn't wearing her uniform. She chose a simple shirt and dark pants, looking far more approachable than the elite operator the media had portrayed. It softened the space, making her seem less like a famous guest and more like an older sister returning to share a story. The principal introduced her briefly and invited her forward. Standing before so many young faces faces, Amina felt a warmth unlike anything from the base. Out there, she had to confront twisted power, but here she faced innocence so pure she worried speaking too firmly might crack it. She began with a gentle, steady voice, slow enough for third and fourth graders to follow. She told them about her early days in the military when she wasn't sure she was strong enough for the grueling training but kept going because she believed everyone deserved a place they wanted to belong to. She talked about missions without describing weapons, focusing instead on teamwork and taking care of each other to survive. Then she spoke about truth, something she believed every person, big or small, must learn to hold even when it frightens them. Truth doesn't make you stronger right away, she said, but it helps you stand tall even when everyone around you wants you to kneel. The children sat still silent as stone. No restless shifting, no chatter, only wide eyes, small hands resting on knees, and tiny breaths of focus. The teachers, leaning against the walls, were just as quiet as if the lesson was meant for them too, and not only for the students. When Amina paused to take a sip of water, a small hand rose. She recognized Lana instantly. The girl wore a pale blue dress, her hair tied in a simple ponytail, her round eyes bright with curiosity and admiration. She sat beside Mira, her mother still carrying the uneasy expression of someone who remembered every second of that afternoon in the parking lot. Today, she had brought Lana because she wanted her daughter to understand the whole story, not through fear, but through what was right. Amina nodded and smiled at Lana. "What would you like to ask?" Lana rose slowly, her hands gripping the hem of her shirt, but her voice rang clearer than many adults dared to speak. Were you scared?" The question silenced the entire room. Children turned to look at one another, and a few teachers glanced toward Amina as if they wanted the answer. Mira placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder not to stop her, but to reassure her gently. Amina looked at Lana, her gaze softening in a way only those who have endured much, yet remained standing, could manage. She stepped down from the small stage, walking toward Lana's row so the whole room could hear her while making sure Lana felt the sincerity in every word. "Yes," Amina said, "I was scared." The auditorium seemed to lean forward as one to hear more. Amina continued, her voice calm but carrying the weight of someone who had faced unjust violence and lived its truth. "Everyone gets scared. Scared of getting hurt, scared of being lied to, scared of standing alone against what's wrong." She knelt so she was eye level with Lana, resting a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "But what matters is that I didn't let fear decide for me." Lana looked back at her eyes shining, but without tears. She was absorbing something larger than a simple moral lesson, something even many adults struggle to face. "A Navy SEAL isn't someone who never feels fear," Amina continued. "A Navy SEAL is someone who still chooses what's right, even when they're most afraid." Her words rippled through the small room. A boy in the fourth row lifted his hand instinctively, as if to say he understood. A girl on the right placed a hand over her heart. Several teachers exchanged glances, some nodding slightly, as though they had finally found an answer to questions they never knew how to teach. Mira squeezed Lana's hand, not out of fear this time, but out of pride. Seeing her daughter ask so directly, she felt she had opened the right door by choosing not to stay silent. Her eyes met Amina's for a brief moment, no words spoken, but gratitude unmistakable. Amina rose and returned to the stage. "Remember this," she said, her voice not loud, but echoing like a vow. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is stepping forward even when you're still afraid." The applause that followed wasn't wild, but steady and warm like a wave spreading through every child in the room. It held the clapping of Mira, of the principal of teachers who had taught courage through stories, today saw it standing right in front of them, more vivid than any lesson plan. When the talk ended, students rushed up asking for photos with Amina, asking questions, telling her their parents had seen the video, saying they wanted to grow up strong like her. Amina listened to each one, answering with a smile, not the least bit weary, because she knew what she said today would travel farther than she imagined, settling into the minds of children untouched by prejudice and unbound by fear. and perhaps these very children would become the first generation brave enough to say stop the next time injustice tried to appear. The afternoon settled over the city with a softer shade of sunlight than usual, as if the sky itself were holding on to a bit of warmth after the days of upheaval surrounding Amina's case. On the small road leading into the community center where she was helping host a meeting on public safety cars, slowed when they saw her stepping outside still carrying the same calm demeanor, even though the entire nation had just experienced a moral jolt thanks to the video everyone had seen. Amina walked toward the open courtyard where the air felt far more peaceful than the tense meetings at the base or the chants outside the courthouse. A light breeze moved through the trees, creating a sound as gentle as the city's long exhale. As she approached the steps, Amina saw a young man waiting. He wore an old denim jacket, holding the phone she recognized from countless news clips. Evan Morales looked at her with a mixture of awkwardness and shyness, like someone who had accidentally stepped into an event far bigger than his everyday life. But when Amina came closer, he straightened, fear fading to sincerity. "Ms. Rowe," Evan began, his voice slightly unsteady. I came to say thank you for your courage that day. No one could have stood like that." Amina stopped in front of him, her eyes steady but warm. "You don't need to thank me," she said slowly. "If it weren't for your video, the truth wouldn't have been seen." Her gaze dropped to the phone in his hand, the small device that had become a mirror, exposing an entire act of abuse that could have been buried like thousands of others. Evan lowered his head, turning the phone between his fingers, unsure what to say. His eyes held a weight, not from what he had done, but from what he had witnessed with his own eyes. Every time he replayed the video, the sight of Reed attacking Amina, the impact against the glass, the hateful shouting mixed with insults, it still sent cold fear through him. He looked up again, his expression carrying the loss of someone whose trust had been broken. "I don't trust the police anymore," Evan said, his voice tight but honest. "Not after this. I thought they were supposed to protect us, but seeing what Reed did terrified me. It made me think any one of us could be next." Amina looked at him not with judgment or dismissal, but with an understanding that seemed to see straight through to the fear he was holding. She knew that feeling, having faced it not only on battlefields but in the quieter, darker corners of civilian life, when people lose faith in the very system meant to keep them safe. She didn't speak right away. Instead, Amina gently placed a hand on his shoulder, the touch light but steady enough to calm part of the trembling he carried. "Don't lose faith." Her voice was low, even carrying the strength of someone who had stood before danger, yet chosen to move forward instead of shrinking back. "Demanding justice is something we have the right to do, and the system has to change to be worthy of that trust." Evan looked at her as though he had never heard anyone speak about justice with such certainty. He took a deep breath, shaky but long, as if trying to swallow the remaining knot of frustration inside him. "But if I hadn't recorded that day," he continued, "they would have lied. And who would believe an ordinary person like me? Who would believe you?" Amina replied immediately, without needing to think. "The truth has its own voice," she said. "Sometimes it gets buried, sometimes ignored, but when someone gives it light, it finds its way up. You did that, not because you're special, but because you chose not to stay silent." Evan let out a small laugh, a smile carrying embarrassment mixed with gratitude. "I just thought if I stood there and did nothing, I wouldn't be able to live with myself." Amina nodded, her eyes deep but not sad. "And that's what makes you different." For a moment, something shifted between them, a quiet realization on Amina's part that Evan was not just the person holding a phone in the crowd that day. He represented everyone who witnesses injustice and decides to shoulder responsibility instead of turning away. But she also saw a deeper exhaustion in his eyes, the kind carried by someone who has seen the dark side of power far too close. Evan looked down at his shoes, then lifted his gaze again, his voice small but firm. "I don't know if I'll be brave enough to face something like that again in the future, but that day, watching how they treated you, I couldn't stay still." Amina smiled. Courage isn't about being ready, she said. Courage is stepping forward when you aren't. A soft breeze moved through the trees, sending a few dry leaves drifting across the ground. Something in Evan's expression eased as if her words had just propped up a part of the fear inside him. He stood a little taller, shoulders relaxing, breath settling. Thank you, he said, not for that day, but because today you gave me hope. Amina stepped back half a pace, offering a nod in place of a blessing. Keep speaking up, she said, not for me, but for the people who can't protect themselves. Evan looked at her one last time, a faint smile brightening his whole face. I'll try. He turned and walked toward his car, his steps slow but steadier now. Before opening the door, he glanced back at Amina, his eyes no longer filled with confusion, but with something that resembled resolve newly formed by their conversation. Amina stood still watching him go. There were no cheers, no applause, no cameras capturing the moment. But in the quiet, she felt the weight of what was right being passed forward like a small flame carried by someone walking into the distance. Evan closed his car door and drove away, and Amina turned back toward the entrance of the community center, feeling her steps grow a little lighter. Because she knew not every battle erupts in a parking lot. Some happen inside each person between fear and what's right. And if one more person like Evan chooses the flame over the dark, the world becomes a little brighter. The community center that afternoon had been arranged into a quiet space for the reconciliation meeting. Light from the tall windows streamed in, forming long bands across the wooden floor, while outside the distant sound of children playing drifted in like a soft layer behind the heavy conversations the adults were preparing to face. Amina stood by the refreshment table, pouring a cup of cooling tea, letting her eyes rest on the room as members of the community council set out chairs and prepared documents. She didn't feel tense, but she wasn't comfortable either. Meetings like this required gentleness and firmness at the same time, something she had mastered as a SEAL but found difficult in a different way in civilian life. The door opened, and the man she knew she would have to face walked in. Brent Cole. He wore a pale shirt, the collar slightly loose, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Compared to the last time she saw him, Cole looked smaller, as if the past weeks had drained whatever faint confidence he once carried. He hesitated at the doorway, eyes on the floor, before glancing toward Amina, as though checking whether she would turn away the moment he approached. Amina set down her cup without speaking, but her look was enough to tell Cole he could step forward. He took a deep breath and moved closer, though every step seemed weighed down by what he carried inside. When he stood before her, he bowed his head instead of greeting her. His shoulders trembled slightly, not out of fear of her, but fear of the truth he was about to speak aloud. I wanted to talk. Cole began, his voice hoarse and small, as though speaking any louder might spill the shame inside him. I've been waiting for this day. I needed to see you. Amina nodded once her hands clasped in front of her. Go ahead. Cole pressed his fingertips together, still unable to lift his eyes. I was wrong. He said the words, releasing a knot he had pulled too tight in his chest. I was afraid of Reed. I was weak. Each word came out trembling, not performed, but painfully true. That day, I knew he crossed the line. I knew he was abusing his power. I saw you being treated unfairly, but He stopped, swallowing hard. I didn't do anything. Amina looked at him, neither angry nor gentle. Her gaze was straight as a drawn line, as though cutting through the words to reach the deeper part of him. Silence in the face of wrongdoing is complicity, she said, her voice steady enough to make Cole shiver. Cole closed his eyes, as if the sentence wasn't something he didn't know, but something he had feared hearing from the person harmed. He opened them again, meeting Amina's gaze without retreat. I know, and that's what haunts me every day. He placed a hand on his chest as if to steady a heartbeat gone uneven from strain. I don't want to be that kind of man, but I became him. Amina didn't answer right away. She watched Cole for several long seconds, as if weighing what kind of man he was, someone looking for excuses to escape blame, or someone who truly wanted to make things right. And the truth showed plainly on his face. Like spread in ink, Cole hadn't come to defend himself, but to take responsibility. She She drew in a slow breath, not to soften her stance, but to choose the right word. When you stayed silent, she said, you helped the wrong people grow stronger. Cole lowered his head, her words cutting deeper into the shame already carved inside him. But unlike many who recoil when confronted, he didn't step back. He stood firm, partly because he knew he deserved to hear it, partly because he knew that if he didn't face it now, he would carry the weight forever. I don't expect you to forgive me, Cole, said his voice, cracking in two uneven beats. I just want... He hesitated, then exhaled. I want to stop being wrong. The simplicity of that confession made Amina's shoulders ease by a fraction. Not because she forgave him, but because she recognized something important. Cole's remorse was not the same as Reed's deceit. Reed hated Reed, insulted Reed, wanted to impose power on anyone he thought beneath him. Cole was afraid, and that fear had made him choose silence. The mistake was serious, but not beyond repair. Amina stepped forward, looking directly into his eyes. If you want to make it right, she said slowly, each word landing like a stone, forming a new foundation. Start today. Cole lifted his gaze, his eyes wet. How he asked, his voice fragile but honest. Amina replied, face the truth. Stand up when you see injustice, even when the person causing it is your colleague. Become someone you can respect. And when you have the chance, tell this story as a lesson, not as an excuse, but as a warning. Cole absorbed every word. Her final sentence left him still, as if his chest had opened enough space to place the new version of himself he wanted to build. I will, he said, not to earn her approval, but from real resolve. The air in the room lightened. The distant sound of children playing drifted through the open window, carrying a warmth both of them needed in that moment. Amina looked at Cole once more, not smiling, but with an expression less cold. Action is the only apology that means anything, she said. Cole nodded this time firmly. Thank you for talking to me, he said. I was afraid of this, but now I know I needed it. Amina gave a small nod in return. She didn't promise forgiveness, nor offer comforting word. For her, this moment wasn't about quick healing. It was about laying the groundwork for the accountability Cole had to carry. When he walked out of the room, his silhouette looked lighter than when he entered. Not because his guilt was gone, but because he had finally faced it. Amina stayed still for a moment, listening to the sounds from the yard drifting in like a reminder that the world kept moving, and that conversations like this were the small necessary steps that made the path toward justice less broken. Twilight draped over the pier like a thin veil, marking the close of a long journey. The last streaks of sunlight stretched into pale orange across the water, the same place where Amina used to steady herself before every mission. But today was different. Today, she stood there not to prepare for an operation, but to look back on a battle she never chose yet was forced to confront. The breeze carried a faint salt scent from the sea brushing against her jacket, while the water below reflected her silhouette, like the elongated shadow of someone who had walked through pain yet remained standing. The sound of waves striking the wooden posts, the faint metallic clinks from boats tied nearby, and the wind sweeping across the pier formed a low, steady harmony that made Amina fall into the rhythm of the ocean's breath. She placed her hand on the cold rail fingers that were used to grip in heavy gear, and facing danger, now resting lightly as if testing the quiet she often forgot she deserved. Many days had passed since the trial. No more shouting outside the courthouse. No more reporters pressing in like waves crashing against the shore. The city had settled back into its usual rhythm, but not entirely unchanged. Evan's video, her conversation with Cole, the public statements from military leadership, and the sudden unity of ordinary citizens had created an echo far wider than a single incident. Something had awakened. Trust in justice was warmed again, not by explosive anger, but by the steady resolve of a people who dared to say enough. Amina knew she could not change an entire system alone, but she also understood that sometimes a single truth revealed at the right moment could become a foothold for countless other voices to rise. And today, as she looked at the rippling surface, she saw a reflection, not of a victim, but of someone who had stood up to defend her honor and the dignity dignity of those long buried under silence. She closed her eyes for a few seconds. Images flickered in her mind. Reed shouting in blind rage, Cole trembling as he confessed his failure, little Lana raising her hand with a question heavier than any chant shouted by adults, Evan clutching his shaking phone, and her teammates standing behind her like pillars. All of it intertwined into a story she never thought she would live through, but now it had become part of who she was. Amina opened her eyes. The sky had softened into pale violet, the final light clinging to the surface of the water and catching on her face. Behind her, steady footsteps approached. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Her commander stopped a few steps back, keeping enough distance not to interrupt her moment, yet close enough that she could feel the presence of someone who had supported her through every turn of the ordeal. "Long day, isn't it?" he said, his familiar deep voice carrying across the breeze. Amina smiled faintly, still looking ahead. "A long day, and maybe a necessary one." He nodded. "You handled yourself better than most people would in that situation. Not everyone can stay that composed." Amina exhaled softly. "I only did what I believed was right." Her commander stood beside her, arms crossed. "Sometimes the right thing is the hardest thing to do, but it's that difficulty that creates strength." The late sunlight fell across his face, highlighting the deep lines etched near his eyes. Battlefields and the lives he had witnessed had carved those marks, yet the look he gave Amina now wasn't the scrutiny of a superior officer, but the respect of a longtime comrade. A voice seemed to rise not from any one person, but from the quiet settling around her. "We don't choose the color of our skin, but we choose how we treat one another." Amina let her shoulders relax, letting that sentence blend with the breath of the sea wind. The words settled like a thin layer of mist over the pier, making the moment feel complete, as if the universe itself agreed with the simple, powerful truth. She turned her posture steady, her shadow stretching long across the wooden planks like a bold stroke painted by the setting sun. Her footsteps sounded firm, carrying a lightness born not from victory but from having faced what needed to be faced and standing tall while doing what was right. From a distance, the waves kept breaking like the ocean's quiet reminder that her journey did not end here but would continue in ways quieter yet deeper. Amina paused at the end of the pier, turning back to look at the ocean one last time. The final light faded, and the water shifted from pale orange to deep blue, like a mirror holding both what had passed and what still lay ahead. She lifted her chin slightly as the wind swept her hair back. "Justice isn't built on power," the voice continued, steady and grounded like an oath carved into stone. "It's built on truth." Amina descended the wooden steps, heading toward the narrow path leading back to the base. As she walked, her shadow blended into the gathering dusk, but did not disappear. Instead, it appeared more defined with every step, a quiet reminder that even when darkness comes, those who stand upright leave a mark on the path behind them. The last breeze swept through, carrying the sound of waves hitting the hulls of nearby boats. And in that moment, like the end of one chapter opening into another, truth remained solid, bright, impossible to obscure. Amina Rowe's journey closed in the slanting evening light on the pier, but its echo stretched far beyond any shoreline or wooden dock. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon outside a convenience store where officers Reed Harker and Brent Cole exposed the darkest side of their authority when they approached Amina with contempt and prejudice. They didn't know that the black woman they belittled was a Navy SEAL who had carried out missions respected even by top commanders. They knew even less that their impulsive actions would ignite a spark, forcing the entire city and eventually the nation to confront the way the system treated citizens dismissed simply because of their skin color. Throughout everything that happened, Amina chose not to respond with anger, but with the calm of someone who understands the value of truth. When Reed hurled fabricated accusations, when Cole stayed silent on the sidelines, when the crowd began to be pulled into the rising tension, Amina held on to her dignity. The moment she restrained Reed with a precise movement, and the seal badge fell to the ground before everyone's eyes. The truth was illuminated with a light no one could deny. The video Evan Morales recorded spread quickly as a warning and became the evidence that ensured the entire incident could not be pushed into silence. When the system was forced to confront the truth, the fracture within the police department became inevitable. Reed clung to his distorted reasoning. Cole stood between honesty and fear, and the internal affairs investigator forced them to face the racial admission Reed could not take back. The interagency hearing between the military and the police exposed all the evidence, paving the way for Reed's detention and Cole's probation. Behind it all, Amina's composure became the axis that kept the story from turning into a violent confrontation and anchored it firmly in the pursuit of justice. After the trial, Amina chose to return to the base, where her teammates offered not grand speeches, but a deep and quiet respect. She became an inspiration to local students when she spoke about courage and truth. She helped Lana understand that fear is not shameful, that what matters is refusing to let fear lead. Her meeting with Evan helped him reevaluate his trust, not to place blind hope in the system, but to remind himself that an ordinary person's action can alter the direction of an entire community. Even Cole, who once stood on the wrong side, found a chance to make amends through a direct conversation with Amina. She did not ease his guilt with easy forgiveness, but opened a path for him to take responsibility for what he had done. As dusk settled over the ocean, Amina watched the waves pass like chapters closing behind her. She did not crown herself a hero, but the fact that she chose to stand upright before injustice, not with violence but with truth, turned her story into a spark that shifted the awareness of many. Her steps leaving the pier were a reminder that justice is not the system's burden alone, but the result of the right actions taken at the right moment by those who choose to speak up. From this story, 3 major lessons remain. The first is the power of truth. Truth does not rise to the surface on its own, but when someone shines a light on it, it stands firmer than any excuse. Amina did not shout to prove her innocence. She let truth speak through her actions, through her composure, and through allowing the evidence to speak at the moment it mattered. The second lesson is the responsibility of the bystander. Evan was not a soldier or a person with authority, but he chose to act when he witnessed what was wrong. His video became the bridge that allowed the community to see the full truth, and Cole became proof that silence has consequences, and that sometimes admitting a mistake is harder than facing the powerful. The final lesson is how one person can inspire others simply by continuing to walk upright instead of collapsing under injustice. Amina did not let her past define her, nor did she let others' prejudice blur her sense of worth. She chose to stand on the side of what is right, and because of that, people like Lana and Evan could see something the previous generation never fully said aloud. Change begins with each individual who dares to say no to what is wrong. As the last light faded, Amina's story did not end. It became a reminder that justice does not come from who is stronger, but from who has enough courage to speak the truth. And that is something every person who witnesses this story can carry with them. In the midst of life's complexities, we still have the right to choose how we treat one another. And sometimes a single person standing up at the right moment is enough to shift the world a little further toward fairness.